All righty, folks. Hi, everyone. So welcome to the Connecticut Roundtable on Climate and Jobs first 2022 webinar. We welcome you all. I can see a lot of familiar names. You're hiding your faces, so I can't say I see all your faces, but it's good to hear you, see you. Just a couple of things before we get started. As we move forward during the webinar, if you have any questions, please put them in the chat and we will get to them at the end of the presentations. There is a Spanish translation channel that we have if you need to use that. You will see that at the bottom of your screen, hopefully, and you can switch to that channel. We are video recording this. So, and we will put it on our website. So if you miss something, you can pop into that, or you can send it to your friends and let them know that what you've just seen. We are also live tweeting. So if you want to look at your phone and see what's happening on the live tweet, please do so. And that's sort of what the housekeeping looks like tonight. What I also want to just start by saying this. So tonight we're doing a presentation by our two staff people, Michelle Eckman, who's the Associate Director, and Allison Pilcher, who is our Policy Director. And we thought that it was time to do a refresher course, as it were, and to misquote the Buffalo Springfield. There's something happening out there, and it seems like it's pretty clear what's happening out there. So we want to just talk about that, kind of pick our own brains, so to speak, and try to figure out, what are we looking at? What does 2022 look like? We know what last year looked like, and with the pandemic, it wasn't a pretty sight at all. We're not, you all, know this, from me saying this, everyone's talking about a new normal. I think we would prefer not to see a new normal. We want something different. We want some change. And so, part of what I see as change is to stop calling this a climate change and really refer to what it is, a climate crisis. I mean, we're burning down the house. And so we thought just to get a refresher course on how to put the fire out, it might be good to get a perspective from the staff as we're working on this on a daily basis, as many of you are. So we look forward to, at the end of this presentations, to have a discussion. We encourage you to ask questions. We encourage you to discuss afterwards. And so that's enough of me. Welcome again. And I will turn it over to Michelle. Michelle Eckman, you're on.
Thanks, Aziz. So yeah, we might as well just jump right into the presentation. If you want to go ahead and start screen sharing, that's awesome. We are also going to share this presentation after this event. There are some, we've put in hyperlinks to a lot of our sources for the information. So if you ever wanted to dig in deeper, we want you to be able to have access to that. So you can go ahead and go on to the next slide, Aziz. So typically when I have these conversations, I really like a dialogue back and forth. Logistically, that's going to be a little bit challenging. So we will do our best to reserve time at the end for questions that you can ask directly out loud by taking yourself off mute. Or you can, as we go along, put them in chat. If you did want to have a conversation about it, talk directly, and you want to make sure you don't forget what you were going to ask or mention, just make a note of it, and we'll make sure we get to that at the end. So I don't want to assume, and we don't want to assume, that we are all on the same page. We all have the content knowledge that we need to really understand what this climate crisis, this climate catastrophe is all about. So we're just kind of trying to level that knowledge playing field, so to speak. And so we're going to just go into some, a little bit of the climate science. We're going to talk about causes. We're going to talk about impacts. And then we're going to talk about solutions, which is really, really important. I know that stuff always gets left off at the end, but it's really the most important part. And we're going to do our best not to stay in the mud and the murk and the nasty. So you can go to the next slide, Aziz. So something really important to consider is, climates have always changed, right? Earth formed 5 billion years ago. As you can see from this graphic, our temperatures have gone up and down pretty wildly and dramatically throughout the course of our history. But you can see that over in the 5 billion year range, that change was relatively slow. And it's also important to keep in mind there was no life on Earth back in those days. So there were no beings that had to tolerate those wild swings like we do now. And click and advance, Aziz. So it's not that climate is changing as being the problem. It's the speed of that change that is an issue. So I have this problem with the term climate change because it doesn't explain what the problem really is. I'm not like a linguistics person. It comes up with really catchy terms, but there probably could be something better. But I wanted to highlight, and you can keep clicking, you click again for me, Aziz. I wanted to just highlight this part on you can go back one more, the density of the changes, right? You can see those lines that are really smushed together. Those changes, that's an indication of very fast change over a relatively short period of time. You can advance to the next slide. So climates have always changed. Here's another graphic that shows more recent times, 400,000 years ago. You can see that the temperatures are swinging up and down and up and down. What's interesting is that carbon dioxide concentrations really mirror the temperature changes. And again, Aziz, if you could click one more time, there's this, I'm going to highlight the two areas, and one more time, it's the speed of the change, and that's why you get those dense clusters. So that's okay. So we'll just stay here on this slide. This term greenhouse gas, a lot of us are probably familiar with it. It is what makes life possible, right? We tend to use it in a pejorative way. But if we did not have this greenhouse gas effect, meaning these greenhouse gases forming a layer around our atmosphere that helps hold heat in, if that didn't exist, life would never have proliferated on this planet. So that's just another thing to keep in mind. You can go to the next slide. So when I talk about greenhouse gases, I just want to point out we're talking about carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide, and some people may not realize that water vapor is also considered a greenhouse gas. We're not going to go into much detail about these molecules in particular, but you can go to the next slide, Aziz. What is important to note is that these molecules form a blanket around our planet. And this metaphor of a heat trapping blanket is a little bit more inclusive and relevant for more people, because not everybody has experienced a greenhouse or been inside of one or even seen one and can't relate to what that means. But pretty much everybody can relate to, when I put a blanket on me, I stay warmer. The heat that my body is generating is being held, near my body and not escaping to the outside. And that is basically the function, how those greenhouse gases function. And the more that we have been putting into our atmosphere, the thicker the blanket, and the heat from that is in our planet is not escaping to the outer solar system. And that needs to happen. We need to dump the heat. Well, we're preventing the heat from being dumped. So you can go to the next slide. So, like I just mentioned, heat would be bouncing off the surface of the planet, escaping to the outside solar system. The blanket around the Earth of those greenhouse gases is preventing that from happening. So you can click to the next slide. So why so fast? Talked about it's the speed of the change that's the problem. So why is this why is the change happening so fast? So I really love this metaphor of a bathtub, right? So we've got, we're pulling fossil fuels out of the core of the underneath the surface of the earth. We're combusting it, we're burning it to produce energy, to make things, electricity, make cars go, any kind of engine. And that is putting a ton of those greenhouse gases into our atmosphere at massively high rates, right? Think of like a faucet just dumping tons of water into that bathtub. But then our sinks, the things that would be absorbing things like carbon dioxide, like our oceans, our healthy soils and plants, is diminishing and diminishing all that time. That sink, that drain hole is getting smaller and smaller the more we develop the surface of our earth. So we're just not getting the absorption that we need to compensate for the amount that we're putting in. What's going to happen? The tub's going to overflow. And how do we know this? Well, we've got tons of fossil records that, I'm not going to go into the science of all of this, but essentially there are these chemical fingerprints that are laid within ice cores. If you look at the images on the lower left, those are some images of ice cores that NASA was taking out of Greenland back in 2005. And there's the carbon dioxide isotopes that get trapped into the ice. The scientists can go back and see how much carbon dioxide was present at certain times, very similar to tree rings. And tree rings are also another, what we call proxy data. Here's data that goes back far longer than we have any kind of written or historical records for. Our living creatures and other abiotic parts of our planet have recorded this information. And so we've got a lot of that data that can then be put into these models that scientists use and are able to validate what our models are showing for our future and comparing to how that relates to the past, and showing basically what the story is in the past, but they're also going into the future. So you can go to the next slide. Another thing I really want to point out is, it's humans that are extracting all of these fossil fuels for our consumption. Our population has been exponentially growing worldwide for, as long as we've been on this planet. And what I see really interesting, and with the population increases, as does the carbon dioxide presence in the atmosphere, the nitrous oxide, the methane, and then along with it, the temperature changes. You can go to the next slide. So here's just another image of how carbon dioxide has increased in our atmosphere over time. You can go to the next slide. And again, the global temperatures have been increasing steadily alongside mirroring that increase in carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. So you may have heard that if we have global temperatures increasing of 1.5 degrees Celsius higher than it is today, that we have some catastrophic issues at hand. And in the Celsius scale, one of the issues that we have here in the United States is that's not what we use. Unfortunately, we're the one of 2 countries on the planet that do not utilize the metric system. But what's important to note that the last ice age, the global temps were 6 degrees cooler than they are today. So only 6 degrees of a global change compensated for the fact that we, on the last ice age, were completely covered with ice here in Connecticut and further south. So just, kind of that context and that perspective is important. You can go to the next slide. And so there's this positive feedback loop that Allison is going to take it from here, and she's going to go into her story is going to be a little bit more positive than mine, but hopefully give you some food for thought.
Yeah, I hope so. I hope it is. Yeah, so Michelle explaining how we're seeing this really rapid change. And the reason that we see the climate changing at a faster and faster pace is because of something called a positive feedback loop. And these exist within our climate system. A positive feedback loop occurs in nature when the product of a reaction leads to an increase in that reaction. And that probably doesn't mean anything when I say it like that. So I'm going to give you an example. So one example of a positive feedback loop is the loss of sea ice. If you wear a white shirt on a hot day, it's going to keep you a lot cooler than if you're wearing all black. Similarly, light colors like ice reflect sunlight back into space, keeping us cooler, whereas dark colors like ocean water absorb sunlight energy as heat. So as more ice melts, the more heat is absorbed by the ocean, and the more our climate warms, which then leads to more ice melt, repeating the cycle. And there are a lot of different positive feedback loops related to climate change. As another example, melting permafrost, so layers of ice and mud thawing in the Arctic, are releasing methane, which is a powerful greenhouse gas that's going to farther accelerate warming and further accelerate melting permafrost. So every bit of warming moves us further and further from this balanced state of our climate, and it's going to make it harder to return to that state. Can you head to the next slide, Aziz? And these positive feedback loops help explain some headlines like these. Researchers find glaciers are melting faster than expected. 2021 was Earth's 6th hottest year on record, temperature reports say, and a hotter future is certain, climate panel warns. But how hot is up to us? Next slide. So at just 1.5 degrees Celsius warming from our pre-industrial baseline, which is a little over 3 degrees Fahrenheit, 14% of all people will be subject to at least one heat wave every 5 years. At 2 degrees Celsius, just half a degree warmer, this number jumps to 37%. That's a big difference for half a degree, and we see similar trends with most of the impacts of climate change, where exponentially the warming is increasing because of these positive feedback loops. Heat waves are really important because they affect outdoor workers. They can cause deaths in vulnerable populations, including children and older people, and those who don't have access to air conditioning. Heat waves can also kill off crops and cause drought and lead to food and water scarcity. Most of the impacts of climate change are far-reaching like this and impact human societies in multiple ways. Next slide. So looking at some of the sources of greenhouse gases, both transportation and buildings are significant sources of greenhouse gas emissions. Vehicles typically require burning petroleum products in order to move, and even electric vehicles that are charged from the grid get at least some of their energy from power plants that burn fossil fuels to create electricity, although they're still more efficient than the traditional combustion vehicles and can be powered in whole or part by renewable energy. Buildings use fossil fuels for heating, cooking, and electricity. Go back a couple, back a few more. Back there, thank you. Yeah, that's the one. So the term fossil fuels refers to non-renewable energy sources like coal, natural gas, and oil. And these are called fossil fuels because they come from the fossilized buried remains of plants and animals that lived millions of years ago. In addition to the emissions produced by burning fossil fuels in our vehicles and our buildings, producing fossil fuels through drilling, mining, and refining and transporting them for use is also responsible for significant greenhouse gas emissions. Next slide, please. So taking a quick look at Connecticut's greenhouse gas emissions by sector, transportation is the most significant source of greenhouse gas emissions in Connecticut. But when you add up commercial, residential, and industrial buildings and the electricity used in them, buildings produce even more. So as important as it is to electrify our transportation system through electric vehicles and electric public transit options, it's equally important to electrify our buildings so that they're not reliant on fossil fuels for things like heating and cooking. As an increasing percentage of our electric grid is powered by renewable energy, the benefits of electrification will only continue to grow. Next slide. So these are just some of the climate change impacts associated with global warming. Permafrost melt, loss of sea ice, glacial melt, sea level rise, ocean warming, changes in ocean currents, ocean acidification, changing habitats, loss of biodiversity, changes in weather patterns, increased risks of drought, increased risks of severe weather events, and positive feedback loops, as we've been talking about. Impacts are not going to occur evenly across the globe because of positive feedback loops. The Arctic and oceans are the most affected by warming. Areas of the Arctic are warming 8 to 10 times faster than the global average, and oceans have absorbed a lot of the excess warming, which is causing sea level rise and ocean acidification. One of the most well-known results of ocean acidification is how the change in pH is killing off coral reefs. And even in the same locations, not all people are affected equally because people have different resources to cope or adapt to climate change impacts. On a global scale, the most vulnerable populations are less developed nations near the equator, island nations, and nations in the global south. But sadly, on both the local and global scales, those most impacted by climate change often have the least political power to advocate for change, which makes it even more important for all of us to engage on this issue. Next slide. So risks of these changes to the global climate that affect humans are so-called natural disasters that are made much worse by human-caused climate change. For example, more heat in the atmosphere and in the ocean increases evaporation, leading to more intense storms and more intense storm surges. Impacts to human health are an issue which I'll elaborate on in a moment. Biodiversity loss due to habitats changing faster than species can adapt. Decreased agricultural productivity due to severe weather, including storms, droughts, and wildfires. Global conflict due to displacement, mass migration of climate refugees, and resource scarcity. But there are also opportunities presented by this crisis. One that we like to focus on is the opportunity to create good jobs. The emergence of these new green technology sectors creates an opportunity to build a workforce from the ground up. So for us, that means that we need to be advocating for these sectors to have good wages and benefits. And we need to make sure that they are creating jobs that are inclusive and accessible to people who are losing their employment as we transition from fossil fuels, but also to people who were never given opportunities in those polluting, but honestly well-paying sectors in the first place. So as we address climate change, we're going to also be forced to address other forms of pollution simultaneously, which will create a better environment for everyone. Next slide, please. So some of the public health impacts include greater incidence of heat and air quality related illnesses, increases in infectious disease like Lyme disease, which I'll talk a little bit more about, decline in water quality from increased water runoff during heavier rainfalls, and increases in disasters related to severe storms. Next slide, please. As one example, here are some photos of flooding here in Connecticut. In flooding events like these, contaminated runoff from roads and fields is washed into water bodies. Organic pollutants can cause algae blooms, and all sorts of contaminants can make the water unsafe for both humans and animals. Next slide, please. This map shows how reported Lyme disease cases have increased in these different states since 1991, based on the number of new cases per 100,000 people in these 15 states where Lyme disease is most common. Many infectious diseases like Lyme disease spread faster in warmer years because the vectors or the animals that carry and spread it survive and thrive more with milder winters. So in the case of Lyme, a warmer climate has allowed ticks that carry Lyme disease to increase their geographical range. And I just want to note here that the gray areas just represent that the data has not been tracked in a consistent way over time, and we would expect to see similar trends in those shaded gray states. Next slide. So why is it so difficult to address climate change despite all of these known impacts, which are pretty severe? One of the first ones that we hear is that it doesn't affect me or it doesn't affect my family. And I would argue that climate change is already affecting all of us. We've seen schools closing during heat waves. We've seen flooding in our coastline communities. We see increase in prices where things like drought and storms affect agricultural products. And we've seen an increase in health issues like Lyme, asthma, and even arthritis. The other thing that we hear is that the science is still uncertain, and I want to take a moment to address this one. Fossil fuel companies and big polluters have taken a page from big tobacco to create doubt around the science of climate change. They don't even need to say the science is wrong, because just saying it's not certain yet is enough to prevent people from taking action. The mainstream media also likes to suggest that scientists are divided around half and half on the issue of climate change. And they often do that by inviting one climate scientist and one so-called climate skeptic, so that on screen it looks like an even debate. However, there's a very strong consensus among scientists that climate change is real, happening now, and caused by human activity. 97 to 100% of scientists agree with this consensus, depending on whether you look just at publishing climate scientists, which is closer to 100% agreement, or scientists in any field publishing on related topics. This is about as certain as you're ever going to get with the scientific community, which avoids making decisive statements about how evidence should be interpreted. So if there's one takeaway from this webinar, it's that scientists agree that climate change is real, happening now, and caused by human activity. So the other thing that we hear is, why act if what I do won't make a difference? Can you go back, Aziz? Luckily, it's not a lost cause. We do have the technology to address climate change through mitigation and adaptation, which I'll explain a little bit more about in a moment. But we really need our local and state elected officials to hear from their constituents that climate change and climate action are important to them, because right now they're hearing from major polluters that are lobbying to avoid any sort of regulation. And finally, the other main argument that we hear against climate action, or the other thing that's making this difficult, is people have a sense that it doesn't align with their politics. And I would say that climate change affects everyone, regardless of their political beliefs. Wanting cleaner air and safer, healthier environments is not a partisan issue. And there are a lot of different solutions for climate change, some that fit more into a conservative ideology, like market-based solutions. And it's an issue when one party decides that ignoring the issue of climate change is part of their platform, as we've seen on the federal level, because then that party excludes itself from the conversation about which solutions we should seek to implement. So no matter which party you affiliate with or which party your representatives belong to, it's still valuable to let them know that you understand climate change is an important issue to address. Next slide, please. So I want to quickly go over a few terms to start thinking about different ways we address the climate crisis, and to help create a shared language for future discussions, including upcoming webinars in this series. A little plug there. So these terms are mitigation, adaptation, resistance, and resilience. Next slide, please. Mitigation is the action of reducing the severity, seriousness, or painfulness of something. So in the context of climate change, this means reducing greenhouse gas emissions through actions like energy conservation, energy efficiency, and electrification paired with renewable energy. Basically anything that prevents greenhouse gas emissions. When the bathtub is overflowing, the first thing you do to fix the situation is to turn off the tap. Similarly, mitigating greenhouse gas emissions should be our first priority to addressing the climate crisis. Next slide. Adaptation is the action of becoming adjusted to new conditions. In the context of climate change, this means adjusting the impacts of climate change, adjusting to the impacts of climate change by updating flood zones, relocating away from the coast, building seawalls, changing where crops are grown, protecting coastal ecosystems to defend against storm surges, and things like that. Adaptation includes improving both resistance to and resilience to the impacts of climate change. And this map here is showing in the purple areas where flooding would occur with 6 feet of sea level rise, which is possible within the next century. Experts are predicting by 2030 we'll experience about 6 to 10 inches of sea level rise. Next slide. Resistance is the ability to not be affected by something especially adversely. In the context of climate adaptation, this means reducing the vulnerability of our communities by minimizing exposure to hazards creating microgrids with battery storage to reduce power outages during severe weather events. Next slide. And finally, resilience is the capacity to recover quickly from difficulties. So in the context of climate adaptation, this means the ability to bounce back from impacts that we could not resist, such as by training workers and developing plans to respond to power outages quickly and effectively. And another big part of resilience is so-called soft infrastructure, which might look like a community that takes care of its members and looks out for one another. Next slide. So finally, I do want to leave you on an optimistic note. For those of us who are engaged in climate activism or just aware of the climate crisis as an existential threat, there can be a lot of anxiety and feelings of helplessness and dread, but we're still capable of addressing this crisis and are seeing slow but steady progress in the right direction. Even as the federal government is too slow to respond, state and local governments are stepping up. So with continued awareness and interest in climate change, we have a lot of power through collective action. Next slide. So on that note, I encourage you to stay involved with us, look for our action alerts on social media, and attend our upcoming webinars where we will dive deeper into practical solutions. And I think we're ready to take some questions.
Representative Michelle.
I mean, I don't have much of a question. I thought that was great. I mean, it's very difficult to paint a picture of climate change, you know, a broad picture of it, because it's very complex. There's many things at play. So I just really appreciated that presentation, and thank you all for doing this. And I particularly did like the association with climate and the ocean, because it's often missing, and it's kind of missing in the, you know, it's like we need to fight climate change by, there's many things that we need to do, fighting the emissions, right, and lowering the emissions, adaptation, all those things, mitigation, retrofitting, all that stuff. But then there's also protecting what's also protecting us now, by not adding more stresses to an ecosystem on land and in the water. More, I mean, I would say the oceans are typically forgotten in this, and we have amazing, crazy activities in the ocean going on right now, very destructive. And so these are things, these are like, it's always an element that's kind of missing, and I just really enjoyed the presentation. Sorry, thank you. And thank you, all of you, for organizing this.
Thank you, Representative Michelle. Lawrence Schwartz, you have a question? Unmute yourself when you're ready.
Okay, hello.
Hi.
I just want to thank the presenters. I think they did an excellent job. They presented what the problem is, and they presented possible solutions. I have a question regarding the graph that has the impact of transportation and other stressors, you can call them. And I was curious, what's the impact of the fact that the majority of the people on the planet eat meat, and many people have lawns and lawnmowers and blow leaves? And if the culture changed, such as maybe if more people tried to become more of a vegetarian or plant-based diet, and if people were less obsessed with having carpets for their yards and didn't have to blow away, how much would that reduce compared to the things you had graphs of?
It's a great question. And I wish I had numbers for you, but I don't. I will tell you, you know, burning fossil fuels is not the only issue. In the agricultural sector, you have issues with fertilizers, even beyond like all of the tractor emissions and things like that. And of course, we know cows are significant producers of methane. I personally am vegan, so I hear what you're saying and I agree with you, but I don't have those numbers in front of me.
I don't either, though. I think in some of the hyperlinks that are in our presentation could lead you there, especially that slide when we talk about methane and nitrous oxide being some of the greenhouse gases that we contend with. And those are even more potent because they have a higher impact at lower dosages, so to speak. So a 1 part per million of carbon dioxide doesn't have as much negative impact as 1 part per million of methane or nitrous oxide. And the majority of the sources of that methane and nitrous oxide is from agriculture, conventional agriculture specifically. Regenerative agriculture is an approach to raising cattle and so forth that accounts for absorption of carbon in its in the cycle throughout the year of grazing that cattle. So maintaining healthy soils and making sure that the animals are rotated on a regular basis so there's consistent ground cover are some of the practices. But if I come across anything else, we'd be happy to share that. And I appreciate that question very much.
Thank you
And
very much.
Lawrence, you bring up an interesting point. I mean, we look at those of us who have lawns and use, well, I don't, but use leaf blowers, and those leaf blowers, the 2-stroke engines on those are massive carbon producers. And the one thing that irritates me beyond recognition is how we indiscriminately cut trees. I mean, trees are carbon mitigators, and we need to really focus on that, to take a look at how we can change the agricultural system as well to, you know, to conform to the crises that we're facing.
I agree. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lawrence. Terry?
Yeah, I'm involved with Commuter Rail Council. So we're trying to expand the rail from Springfield to Worcester to Boston. And I'm also involved with what is going on in Hartford. Hartford right now, 84 and 91, is the most congested intersection in Connecticut, the most congested in New England, and 30th in the country. And that is creating such climate issues. And especially for people that are living like in the city of Hartford, you've got people that are going through the virus, that have lost jobs, that don't have the health care. And we have the 4th highest asthma rate in the country. We have one of the worst water qualities in the country. And a lot of that is because people love their cars so much, they won't get on trains, they won't get on buses. And to me, those are 2 of the biggest things we need to do to say to people, walkable, sustainable communities, leave the car home. And millennials are already doing that. They're already saying, we don't need 2 cars, we need 1.3. And so I think that's a critical point. And I appreciate what you guys have done tonight. Thank you.
Thank you. And I think you can add to that list, Terry, bike riders, right? The increase in people who are biking has been fairly significant. I don't have those numbers at hand, but I can see it visually. You can see the changes. So it's really important to find different alternatives to transportation. Rail, right? Now, anybody
And
else?
bus.
Yeah, electric buses. Yeah. And I think also you're beginning to see the shift from the automakers into electric cars. And, you know, there's a move afoot in Connecticut to create more charging stations. And once that gets put into place, I think you're going to see electric car sales and usage bloom quite a bit. Anybody else?
Well, thank you for what you've done tonight.
Thank you. And I think one of the things that the slides show too is, you know, the next series, well, we've already seen it, the crisis of immigration from countries that are literally water starved. You know, the war in Syria wasn't so much a revolution as it was a drought, and people left farms and went into the cities, had no jobs. And then no jobs led to, you know, whatever the revolution was there. And then the migration, it's happening throughout the Middle East, it's happening in Africa. And we have to recognize that water resources in particular are going to be the next flashpoints. And so we just need to be aware of what's going on. And we're hopeful that, you know, some of these slides, which a lot of the information you all know, but I think it's good to have this refresher course. You know, when Allison was talking about scientists and how many scientists believe in that, I wish I had it that I could show you. There's a fabulous John Oliver piece where he brings in, the ratio of scientists who believe in climate change to those who don't. And there's like one person standing and brings 90 people into the room with them. And that's the visual that you want to just imagine and to try to move away from, so that you don't listen to that one person or let that one person dominate the conversation. Michelle, Allison, anything you guys want to add?
No, I mean, I'm seeing some names that I haven't seen before, so we're thrilled to have you here. We hope that you stay engaged. I do want to mention that we have an individual membership level now in our organization, which we launched in November, and it has been really successful. So if you like what you see here, or you even want to be more involved so you can see more of what you think we need to be doing, we really encourage your membership. You can just head to our website. There's a tab for membership. You can sign up right on the spot. And we are about to launch our new members only forum, which is going to be a really amazing place for our members to share information, ask each other questions, network on a lot of different topics associated with our climate justice and climate crisis fighting work. So stay tuned for that. We'll be posting more information. You found out about this information one way or another. You will find out about our forum also when that is launched and ready to go.
And while you don't see her, you see her name, Aisha Staggers. We want to thank Aisha. She's our communications director. She's our social media guru. So you can find us on multiple platforms. You can find us on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter. We send out emails. We try to stay in touch with you, and we would love to get feedback from you as well. This organization runs on fumes, literally. And so as you hear more and more about what you need to know, and more about what you know that you can share with us, the more we all know. I mean, this is something that we all need to do together. No one person can change this, and it affects all of us. And I think those slides really showed that. So I want to thank Aisha. I want to thank Michelle and Allison and the board of the Roundtable for all the support that you all give us. And stay in touch, please. Well, there was a question about, do we have a legislative agenda for this year? Allison, that's a good question for you.
Yeah, we have a number of bills that our allies and network are supporting, and we're waiting to see which gain traction. And we will absolutely be engaged in testimony, putting out action alerts, and you will hear from us throughout the session.
And I'm just going to check and see if there's any questions in the chat that we didn't answer. Anybody else before we say goodbye to all of you?
Aziz?
Yes, sir.
I was going to say, do you also engage with bringing, like, in public hearings, or get people to get engaged into the public hearings? Because in case you do something like a presentation on that, I'd be happy to participate. There's like a couple of tips that we always like to bring up to the table. Like, you can get cell phone numbers from legislators that are part of the committee, and who can help with having more time if you need to cover more information in the public hearing, then it is important to get it out. So there's all these little tricks of the trade that more than happy to help, or whatever.
So we always appreciate your help on that one. And as Allison said, when things come up, we will send out action alerts. Representative, you could do the same to us. If there's something that you think we should be involved in, we'll take a look at it and see, make some determinations on it. But I think we're all pretty closely aligned to the work that you're doing.
Yeah, and I was going to say, it's dangerous to look at the bills I co-sponsor, because I tend to co-sponsor a lot of bills. I start with the concept, and then when they change, then I actually go back and remove my name if they change, like if they take a bad direction. But like, I like to emphasize, it's like an emphasis. Some legislators really don't co-sponsor until later in the game. Yeah.
We learned that
Um,
last year.
Yeah. Terry?
Yeah, just one more comment. I was at a meeting today. It was actually held at a bus station in Newington. And it was really talking about desegregate Connecticut. And it was talking about climate change. And it was talking about building affordable housing and other things in rail and bus stations so that we can move people away from cars. So there's a lot going on here. So it's a lot about climate change, but it's also about allowing people, especially in the inner cities, we're trying to change some zoning laws so that those people can move out of Hartford and take a bus or a train. Our millennials now want, I think, 1.2 cars instead of 2. And we need to change that. Walkable, sustainable communities, and where we can move people out of the inner cities and to places where they work and, et cetera. So this is all very important, but it ties together not just the climate issue, but it ties together some of the racial stuff that's going on in the country. And I appreciate what you've done tonight. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks. Anyone else before we say bid you good night?
Just one more thing, sorry. I love the question about the link with veganism. Clearly, I'm vegan, and I'm one of the few. It's very difficult to get good foods over there, except if Fire and Spice is open, then I can get food over there. But yeah, it's important, and I think more education should be done at the Capitol in regards to the impact of foods. I've been trying to help a bill, which is a bill that addresses emissions from foods, and it's sponsored by Mercy for Animals. It's a very interesting bill, and there's several states in the US that are working in such bill. You know what the problem is, though, that I found? Is we don't have a full census of emissions. That's just not properly done. If we want to address the problem, we really have to figure out how many emissions from all of our activities, including trawlers. I asked the Deep A, how much emissions are released by the trawlers' heavy gear as they rake the seafloor, because that releases sequestrated carbon. No answer. I mean, we don't know. It's like how much emissions from foods? We don't know. So there's a whole bigger picture, and I think it requires more education from my colleagues. And I'm not saying that in a disrespectful manner, but we all have our areas of interest, and mine happens to be an environment and climate and biodiversity. So. Yeah, but I'm trying to educate also over there, but it's not easy, and the more we are, and it's important because that's how we'll change legislation. Otherwise, we can keep hoping, and we'll continue being delayed in doing the good works. So.
Yeah, and that's why I think it's important to remember the collective work that we all have to do. And Terry, there's something that you said that I want to point back to as well, that the intersectionality of everything, it becomes more and more apparent, doesn't it? And housing, transportation, all of that really becomes something that we need to take closer looks at, because they all are tangentially or even directly involved with the work that we're trying to do here.
Yes.
All righty, folks. Well, thank you again. Check our website. We'll have this on the video up and running. Check all our platforms. Check yourselves. Be careful out there. Be safe. And once again, thank you all for joining. We'll see you on the next webinar, hopefully. Take care, everyone.
Thank you.
Good night.
Good night.
Thank you.
Bonsoir. Thank you.
Right.
Thank you, Eckmans. Thank you for joining.
They're my parents.
I know that.
Right as I was finishing. I'll let you unmute yourself if you guys want to say something. If you know how. They might not know how.
Do we want to stop the recording?
Oh, thank you.
Sure.